It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Tessie Rose Bailey. Dr. Bailey is a national expert on special education, transition, and MTSS and RTI for states and districts through the National Center on Intensive Intervention and the National Center for Systemic Improvement. She is the principal consultant for the National Center on Intensive Intervention and the director of the Center on MTSS. She's the director of the Progress Center, which provides information, resources, tools, and technical assistance services to support local educators and leaders in developing and implementing high-quality educational programs that ensure students with disabilities have access to free, appropriate public education. Dr. Bailey serves as the Project Quality Assurance Director for the Wyoming MTSS Center. And the WDE and our local educators have benefited greatly from having her support for the last 8 years. It's now my honor to turn the time over to Dr. Bailey.
Thanks, Susan. So I am so excited to be here. And I know I always say that, but today is actually one of my most favorite topics to be talking about. And I want to give a special shout out to Tracy, who was the first to respond in the chat box in terms of introducing herself and sharing something exciting in the summer. And so as you take a moment and you're getting organized, for some of you who came on late, just make sure your name and your image is the correct one, and then share in the chat box who you are and something exciting you're gonna do this summer. So thanks Gwen and Haley for sharing as well. So I just want to get us started, and feel free to keep putting stuff in the chat box, and I'm going to encourage you throughout today's session to utilize that as a way to share your comments or ask some questions. We'll also have some opportunities for, sharing out if you want to unmute and sort of verbalize what you're saying, but just make sure that you either raise your hand so we know, and we will unmute you if that's needed. All right. Thanks thanks Lorene and Corrine. Miranda said, wait, summer's coming? If you were in Utah right now, we have all our spring flowers coming, and it's a little nerve-wracking given that we don't have a ton of water. So, all right, and Chris, planting fruit trees. I have 20 fruit trees on my property. It's my most favorite thing, so great. All right. Well, as Susan mentioned, today we're going to talk about the instruction HLPs, and we're going to have a little quiz on how many there are, but we're going to hyper focus on 4 of those. And that's because these are the ones that we found that are most relevant to you in your immediate implementation, and kind of really organize the rest of the HLPs, whether they're assessment HLPs or collaborative HLPs, to allow us to do our work. Now, I'm just going to do a quick review. My assumption is a lot of you were in previous sessions, but just in case, I want to make sure we are on the same page. As a reminder, the high leverage practices, which I'll refer to as HLPs, were drafted for students with disabilities as part of an effort with the CEDAR Center, which is CEEDAR. It's a federally funded center for promoting excellence in educator prep programs, as well as the Council for Exceptional Children, which is one of our primary advocacy groups and membership groups for us that work in the field of special education. As a reminder, they were originally focused on what we need to teach novice teachers or those students who were participating in ed prep programs, and have kind of moved out into the field as sort of defining our practice within special education, as well as within general ed and how we support students with disabilities. I previously mentioned that there are 22 of those high leverage practices within special education, but what we try to do is organize them into sort of these chunks, and that's how we've set up these webinar series. It's not us, like the Wyoming Department of Ed or myself, that's doing it. it really is the field said we've got to sort of organize these, because the way we prepare teachers are often they take an assessment class or they take a series of instructional classes, and we want to be able to chunk those within those courses. We've been focusing either on the assessment one in our last session, as well as this instructional one, which in the first session I kind of highlighted or previewed some of the research that we'll talk about today in terms of what are those instructional HLPs that give us the biggest effect. As Susan mentioned, our next session will be around the social and emotional behavior, and it really sort of looks at one of the high leverage evidence-based practices that we found that produces effects, and I'll share what that one is. We are not doing something around collaboration, but what you'll see is those high leverage practices are essential for us to be able to have, you know, collective assessment when we're gathering from parents and families and students, as well as in terms of guiding our design and delivery of instruction. So we had talked about 3 high leverage practices out of the 22 that we've seen related to assessment. And one of the things that we found within that is that our assessment HLPs are really not supported with the same level of evidence in the research as much as they are for policy. And so what we found is that a lot of the things that we're required to do in terms of special education assessment high leverage practices comes from IDEA, right? Like IDEA is requiring us to create a present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. We need to interpret and share data with families and educators. And then we need to use that assessment data to help us with what we're going to talk about today, which is this idea of initial design for our instruction, as well as the ongoing intensification or individualization of that instruction when students don't respond. So while we won't talk about it, our assumption is we started with data from the very beginning, right? And so if you think about HLPs, we often say, oh my heck, we've got to use these 22 at the same time. They really have their sort of time right within the instructional period. Like we need to use data initially to help us set up what we're going to do for instruction. Then we provide instruction and we use ongoing data to confirm or disconfirm that our design was okay and our implementation was okay. So our session is going to focus on that instructional piece, assuming that we've got good data in hand. I'm going to model some of those. I do have a number of videos today. The handout link that Tom put in the chat box, I do recommend opening that and pulling out at least the high leverage 16, HLP 16 explicit instruction. It's kind of like a little checklist. We're going to do some observations of some teachers today to see what kind of things we see in terms of HLPs in practice. Now, the other thing is just remember that the HLPs that you see were not identified initially from like a meta-analysis. They didn't go out into the research and identify those practices that had existing research base. And instead, they worked with stakeholders and educator prep programs and said, what is it that teachers need to be able to do to be highly effective at their job? And so that's where you get on these recommendation, looking at the practical and ethical considerations that come from IDEA or just working with children, and we identified those practices. Now we're going to do a quick little quiz, and I've done one of these each time, but this is a new one. So how many instruction HLPs are there that have been identified for supporting students with disabilities? So is it just 3? Like in assessment, do we see 6, 9, or 12? So you can just put your answer in the chat box. You can use the 1, 2, 3, or 4, or you can just put the number in, whatever you feel comfortable with. What's your pick in terms of the number of instruction HLPs that we see? Okay, so I see some answers for number 9, for 3. 2. So I see a lot of people saying around that 3 or 6 range. Okay. Interestingly, it's actually 12. So even though there's only 3 HLPs in assessment, there's only 3 HLPs in collaboration and 4 that we see in terms of, 4 that we see for the social emotional, which we'll talk about next time. The rest of them are instruction. And so that's why we had to narrow down what we would talk about today, because trying to get to 4, I think when you were the first one to get that, to get to 12 practices in a single session didn't really make sense. So I'm going to do just a quick true false. And so in the chat box, you can write true or false, or you can just do a T or an F and make it easier. So identifying short and long-term learning goals is an example of one HLP in the instruction practice area. So Miranda says true. What do others think? Lots of T's. Yeah, so you are correct. And we talked about this last time, is a lot of people think about goal setting in terms of assessment. And from an HLP perspective, goal setting, we do use assessment data to really understand where kids are and identify the baseline so we can set appropriate measurable goals. But in reality, this idea of short and long-term goals are really around how we design our instruction and our programming. And we're going to talk about the short and long-term goals today, even though it isn't one of the key ones that we'll be focusing on. All right, so we got one more, true, false. So providing positive and constructive feedback to guide students' learning and behavior is an example of an HLP in the instruction area. Put a little line to separate what we've already done. Yeah, a lot of T's. See, you guys are all gifted now. You are correct. And this is where, the way that we think about instruction, it's not so much like the content or the curriculum or the actual delivery, how I'm sharing that. We think about instruction much more widely, from the initial onset of goal setting all the way through the reflective process that occurs at the end. And that's why you see these 12 practices versus, a third or a fourth of that we see in other areas. So in previous sessions, I've shared that, when we think about high leverage practices and we're trying to develop programming for students, we often think about the IEP, right, as that initial sort of base for our programming. It helps outline the long-term goals that we just saw with that HLP in terms of where do we need to get for the whole year. It also outlines our proposed plan for how we're going to support the student. So we often think about in the development of our high leverage or our educational programming. Now we can develop the greatest plan, and it can have a desired outcome. We can say, yes, if we did this, it would be great. The problem is, if we don't do it, we don't get any effects. So we have to have that multiplier of the implementation to really allow students to access and benefit from programming, right? The programming that's delivered as part of the IEP process, as well as the programming that's part of your general instruction and core programming. So last time I had shared, or 2 times ago, I had shared some data, and a lot of people said, well, heck, I want to learn more about that. So I want to bring it back, primarily because if you look at this data, what you see is there are some practices that have significantly more levels of evidence, meaning they have more studies, more confirmation that these are effective practices. And I'm going to try to clarify that difference between levels of evidence, or the amount of evidence, and the actual impact of that evidence. So if you look at this graph here, you'll start to see a trend. Like those things on the right side seem to be really producing or have a lot of evidence that's been published around whether they work or not. And if you look at from HLP 12 all the way on, what you see are those instructional practices. Now, there is one, this 21, we'll talk about next week. It's kind of the outlier in terms of an evidence-based high leverage practice in another area. But we're going to focus our efforts on this box of HLP 12 all the way through 16. And that's because together these practices create what allows us to be highly effective in instruction. Now you're probably saying, well, why aren't you focusing on that one that has a really tall column? Partly because in it of itself, it could be its own training. And I know Tom Jones is on the call today, and some of you are probably participating in what we refer to as database individualization. This particular practice, which is also evidence-based, is a validated way in which we provide intensive instruction, individualized instruction to students with disabilities. And so if you want to learn more about that, there's a whole suite of other activities offered by the State Department, but we're going to focus on these ones right here that we can do really easily within our setting. Now, I want to just, I talked about the amount of evidence. So that graph we just showed right there showed that there are some of these HLPs, particularly instruction HLPs, that have a lot of evidence about whether they work or not. And really what we care about is, do they work? And if you're familiar with John Hattie often talks about using effect sizes as a way to understand the level of effect or the strength of the effect. And this is important because when we look at high leverage practices, we want to hope that they have a published effect. But what we actually need to do is know that they do. We need to be confident that we're doing the right thing with the right kid at the right time. So effect sizes allow us to do that. If you look here at this yellow piece, you'll see the 0 kind of separates the red and the yellow. The thing about this is we want every kid to start at the 0. Unfortunately, some kids in our school come in with reverse effects, meaning they're set up to benefit at a lower level. For example, kids with ADHD often really struggle in school, so they have some things that are happening that are making it even harder for them to be successful. Things like poverty, a disability, attendance, those things can have a sort of reverse or negative effect. What we also know is that there are things that we can do to overcome those effects. Just generally, kids existing, whether they watch TV or do anything productive, learn. There's like some positive effect that exists. And that's why even kids who have some of those reverse effects are able to be successful. What's most important to me is the teacher effect. I think the data is very strong that teachers have a very predictable and strong effect on student learning. And in fact, we know that on average, the teacher effect is about 0.32. So if you said it came in at 0, that teacher effect really is what is the predictor of whether a kid's going to do well or not. And it's not that they just exist and the teacher's there. It's that the teacher's use of high leverage practices are allowing them to be highly effective, to utilize material that allows them to even have a greater effect. And so if we look at this 0.4, what we want is teachers using practices that enhance the teacher effect, right? It's not the intervention that's the effect. It's the teacher's use of the intervention. It's not the practice that's the effect. It's the teacher's use of that practice that leads to the effect. So in general, when we're looking for things that are highly effective, we're looking for things that are at least above 0.4 if we're going to maintain grade level sort of growth over the years. Or what happens with many kids who are struggling is we need to have more than average growth, because if we don't have more than average growth, the kid is going to continue to fall behind their same grade peers. And remember, our job within special education is to ensure kids have access and benefit from core programming. So I want to share some data. And so these are the 12 HLPs that fall under instruction. And what you'll see is after each of the HLP, there's just a brief description of what it is. You'll see a little parentheses and it says ES, and that's effect size. It's related to what we just saw. Remember, 0.4 is about equivalent to a year's growth. It's kind of what we would get from just general teacher effects. So anything above 0.4 is pretty strong. I've highlighted the 4 of them. Those are the ones that are part of the title that we'll focus on today. But I want to just give you a chance to take a look at these 12 practices and their purported effects and tell me what you think. And you can unmute and share out, or you can just write in the chat box. So I'll be quiet just for a second.
It looks like they're all super effective.
Yes, yes. And that's a great observation, is in our others, we don't have the same level of evidence. Like I shared last week with assessment, we assume it works, but they're more supported by policy. The same thing occurs with all of the other collaboration and social emotional. Some of the practice have an evidence base, but like instruction, who's got 12, almost every one of them has an evidence base. And in some, like you'll look at number 13, has a policy base. So what else do you notice? And thanks, Miranda. Yeah, so Matt's saying using explicit instruction seems to have some of the biggest effects. Totally.
What is the range there on HLP 20? What does that mean?
So HLP 20 means, so they sometimes define it as, and I'll show you on the next slide as well, is individualized instruction and intensive instruction. So it's almost like 2 variables, but they often associate them at the same thing. Yeah. And that's where the individualized instruction doesn't necessarily have the same strength, right? And partly because the outcome of interest is often so unique that it's hard to tell, did it have a broader effect? And so it could be, something related to that, but that's where we see these intensive supports kind of has a range. The other thing too, when we get into evidence-based, sometimes they're more effective in some domains, like maybe we see huge effects in literacy, but we see moderate effects in math. And I think to your point, Miranda, too, is even within this average effect, you probably have this range of effects that exists given grade spans and whatnot. But in general, we see good effects. All right, so I want you all to keep this in mind, because individually, each of these has an effect. And the assumption around the HLPs, right, is that as a teacher, I'm using all of these strategies, right? I'm not going to just spend the year only doing flexible grouping. Flexible grouping by itself, without explicit instruction and without feedback, is probably not going to result in the same outcomes. So if you look at sort of these practices, a lot of times they depend on each other. Explicit instruction, for example, depends on whether there is a clearly defined learning goal. It assumes that you're providing constructive feedback within your modeling and your guided practice that then increases the effect of the explicit instruction. So the practices themselves, particularly in the instruction area, interact with each other to create a collective effect. It can also backfire, right? Because what happens if you're really good at one thing, right? Like providing scaffolded supports, but you're not very strong at providing positive and constructive feedback. What you could get is some effects, but maybe not full effects of the scaffolding, and you're not getting the effects of your constructive feedback for your students. So we're going to look at what this is, and I'll just sort of disclose that these are general effects. So these are not unique to students with disabilities, but just for kids in general, when we look at the research and the meta-analyses, what we start to see is these things have not only lots of data supporting, them as an effective practice, but they have the strength of it. So I shared this image, and I know it's kind of small and fuzzy, but that's what happens, when we do research. We try to make it all sort of pretty so that we can analyze it. But in the first session, I talked about there are some of those practices that, like we just saw, have high effects. And what we want to know is it just effects for certain types of learners in certain certain settings under certain domains. And so what happened is taking those HLPs that you just saw and said, but we want to disaggregate the effects by different disability categories. So if you look down at the bottom, you'll see those in that first box. And then on the right-hand side is using these HLPs for certain domains, right? And that's why I was mentioning like the range. Sometimes we see a lot of strong evidence for its use in math, but the evidence is not as strong in reading, for example. And I have shared that previously, that, you know, even if we look at average comprehension intervention effects, is a lot different than word study intervention effects, right? They're all reading, but we can make greater gains in some areas than in others. So if you look at this, you'll see the darker ones really look at the amount and the strength of the evidence. So that's kind of trying to give us like an indicator of how strong something is. So the ones that I highlighted in the green boxes, you know, anything that's above this 11 and up is around instruction. So that's where we see a lot of the sort of darker shaded areas. But I think what's really exciting is you see it across the disability categories, right? It's not just for you know, kids who have a specific learning disability, that there's evidence for kids with visual impairments or with low incidence disabilities. And that's what makes it high leverage, right? That as a special educator working with students who've been identified as having a disability that affects their learning, these are the types of practices that are going to give me the biggest bang for my buck. It doesn't mean they look exactly the same when I work with a kid who has different cognitive ability, or, you know, maybe is struggling in math or reading, but in general, the practice is similar. The same thing here in this reading and behavior. We don't see the research as strong as we would like to see in all domains, but we do start to see that the practices go across different domains with strong levels of evidence and amount of evidence. And so that's why this session, why we talk about there are 12 practices, but we're really going to only have time to focus on 4 of them. But like I was showing before, they all sort of connect. They kind of come as a family unit when we try to use them in practice. So when we think about these instructional HLPs, what we're really trying to do is to create this strategic, this flexible, recursive process so that we are using what we know around the student needs, our content knowledge, how we deliver instruction, to really be able to provide individualized, intensive supports for students who need it, right? And so when we look at the general HLPs, they tend to be a little bit more broad, right? So they look at things like eliciting response. We assume that teachers are still doing all of those. These are just the practices for instruction necessary for kids with disabilities to be successful in their special education related services, as well as their core programming. So I had shared that a way to think about this, to manage these 12 practices, right? If we try to, implement them all simultaneously, it seems a little overwhelming. So to think about it in terms of an easy to sort of understand instructional cycle, so we can start to add on stuff to make it relevant, we look at this plan, deliver, review, and intensify. And all of the practices that we see under that instructional practice fall here. The ones we're going to talk about today, like HLP 12, is really critical to the design, right? You can't have explicit instruction to deliver if you did not systematically design it, right? So they depend on each other. They're kind of like twinsies in a sense. The same thing is, although we design something to produce results, we implement in a way that it was likely to produce results, we might not get those for some kids. So we need this way to use data to intensify and really adapt the curriculum materials and the instruction and the methodology so that we can support students. And once we do that adaptation, We systematically design with this new knowledge of the student and their needs and implement it, right? And that's kind of how we think about it. What we don't want to think about with instructional HLPs is we do one and then we do another, or we're going to pick and choose the things that we do. It doesn't really work like that in terms of how they end up intersecting. So I'm going to illustrate that. So planning for instruction is really the most critical, and it is most directly related to what we talked about last week, which were the 3 assessment HLPs. One of the things that we really, talked about with that present levels of performance, we have to understand the student's needs in order for us to systematically design something that's likely to address those needs. So this is where it directly connects to previous HLPs. We don't just willy-nilly design something and then hope it works. So in order to use those data, those other HLP assessment HLPs, those data help us set really meaningful learning targets for the student, whether it's the standards that we're using, the IEP goal, or maybe some unit instructional goal that exists. The other thing is that information from the data, as well as our understanding of instruction, helps us be more thoughtful about how we determine this scope and sequence of instruction. And while there's a general scope and sequence that kind of exists, some kids need it at a different pace than others based on their individual needs. And so we plan for that at the beginning. Our understanding then allows us to think about the objectives that we're going to use to guide our general instruction as we get to the next step. So if we think about each of these steps sort of broken down, that meaningful learning target is really the first step. If we don't have a meaningful learning target, we're just providing instruction for the sake of providing instruction. That's why we talk about the IEP goal as being so important to the overall instructional process. And the IEP goal can't be written unless we have a really, robust present levels of performance for the student. So you'll see that HLP 11, that's that instructional long-term and short-term goals. We're going to talk about the long-term goal first. Is we identify that in our IEP, and then we think about from our present levels, what are the prerequisite skills the student needs and has in order to reach that goal. That knowledge then helps us, using that present levels of performance, determine what is a realistic and ambitious learning target for the student. Now, we have to report to parents on a regular basis, and this is where reporting using our progress monitoring data or other data allows us to say, this is the learning target we're working on, the student is progressing towards that, with the assumption is that learning target is going to help the kid get to the long-term goal. Now, once we've got the learning targets clear, we then start to look at sort of the learning sequence, right? How fast are we going to go? What's the level of service necessary for the student to get there? And then we start to plan out kind of our scope and sequence. Now, the thing about special education, even if we have an IEP, just because we plan something out doesn't mean we're stuck with it for the whole year. If our data indicates it's not working or it needs change, we always have that flexibility in that review and intensify. So once we've got our sequence set up with our systematically designed instruction, we start to plan for all of the rest. And so as we saw, like Matt mentioned, the explicit instruction has strong effects. Well, it just doesn't happen on its own. There's a lot of planning that's involved. We plan for the practice opportunities, we plan for the examples we're going to use, the pacing, the way we're going to provide feedback. In effective instruction, this occurs prior to. We often skip this step and just say, oh, well, we're using this curriculum and we just use it. But in reality, the planning is so critical to make sure what we're doing in the way that we're doing aligns with the individual student's needs. And so that's where we've got all of these steps put in place before we even move forward with a single lesson, as well as the program with the IEP. Now you're probably thinking like, well, that's great and all, but I don't really have a lot of time to do that. And that's kind of the reality, unfortunately, with a lot of educators is we skip this process because just planning alone doesn't really lead to the effect. It's the implementation and the delivery that leads to the effect. However, the way we design that intervention or those special education services determines how much effect we're going to get when we deliver it. So there are some like ways in which we kind of help plan. We purchase programs that have, sort of the scope and sequence already built in. We understand how those align with the student's needs. But there's other things, and I'll just share these, that help us think strategically about planning for explicit instruction, right? We know explicit instruction has high effects. It takes a little more effort for us to think about all of the steps in that. So, and I'll just put these in the chat box for you. And these are literacy. There's actually math as well. Allows us to sort of think about the 5 big ideas of reading, where my student might be struggling, and how can I plan for explicit instruction in that area that's likely to produce opportunities for practice to allow the student to progress. And I just showed an example, and I'll do one for word study here. But what we end up seeing, and I'll make this a little bit bigger, tell me if you can't see it, is in our lesson planning, what we're doing is we're outlining the general long-term, right? That long-term is that there's a standard out there. It could be your IEP goal. Then we're looking at what's necessary in terms of short-term objectives to help the student move towards that long-term goal. And then we're planning for all of the materials, the schedule, and we often do this, right, for our paraeducators, but they don't understand where the planning came from. So sometimes there's a disconnect in delivery. So having something set out like this helps clarify that. The other thing is, how are we going to deliver it? And this comes up in our specially designed instruction is we have to articulate what that's going to look like, and then we also have to deliver it, right? So we want to make sure it's written in a way that's explicit, clear, feasibly, can be feasibly implemented. So I'm just going to share, and so these are the math ones. So I'll just put these in the chat box as well. But if you're new to designing instruction or you just don't have enough time, these are some resources that help us think about how we plan for those high leverage practices to provide sufficient opportunities for practice and response. Tom, can you put the link back in the chat box for the materials? I don't think Tammy's looking for that. So while the planning is so important, as I mentioned, and it does have its effect, the thing is the planning alone, the IEP by itself, has zero effect unless it's explicitly implemented. And that's where we get to this idea of deliver, right? That we have to take what we systematically designed that was expected to produce results and put it into place. And as we saw there, this idea of this high leverage practice around explicit instruction has huge effects. It also is multifaceted, right? So it's not just this single thing that we can do. And if you look here, what you'll see is like certain parts of explicit instruction have their own effects. So if we don't fully implement the explicit instructional framework, we might get some effects, but we may not get full effects. So for example, if I only use planned examples, which is a critical piece of explicit instruction, I'm going to get some effects, but not the full effect. The same thing here, if I don't have well-designed practice that's both guided and the independent practice, I'm not going to get the full effects. So that deliver, even though it looks like a single HLP for 16, it has a lot of connection to all of these other HLPs necessary for us to be successful. What's important for us in our practice is our ability to articulate that, right? That's what separates us from somebody who can teach and somebody who is, filling in or wants to do it. If I can say, well, this is why I'm using these examples in this way at this pacing, it makes it clear that I understand my practice and what's likely to produce those effects. So if we look at the instructional framework for explicit instruction, that first part is really like the main thing, the I do, we do, you do. And you'll see that the I do, there is a modeling effect, and kids learn this, right? They just watch you do something and a lot of kids pick it up. A lot of kids who are struggling though need to see it, they need to do it with some support and then continue to practice that. So that's how we get to the explicit instructional framework. This idea of supporting practices, it's almost like all of the other HLPs are necessary for us to get the full effect of explicit instruction, right? So the HLP 12 for systematically design, if I don't design for explicit instruction, I'm not going to be able to implement it. If I don't use immediate specific feedback, I'm not going to get the right response or impact of guided practice. So you can see that while we often talk about a single HLP as being highly effective, the assumption is there are other variables that are part of the implementation of that practice. So you have in your handouts what's like a checklist. And what's cool is we're going to observe some teachers and some videos. You'll be able to look for these features. To what extent did they model? To what extent did they use the whole explicit instructional framework? How was their pacing? What was their feedback? All of those together are the things that we're looking for in effective instruction. And I mentioned this idea of planning, right? It's also not as black or white in how we use explicit instruction. And in that systematically designed instruction, what we might be looking at is the student's current present levels and say, gosh, this is a really new task for the kid. I'm going to spend a third of my time modeling. We're going to spend about 60% of our time doing guided practice with just a little bit of independent practice. So that planning ahead of time helps us determine the extent to which we're doing each of the pieces of that framework, right? So a kid maybe who picks up really quickly or a task that's really easy, like I'll give an example. I want kids to put their folders in some container on the wall. I probably don't have to do guided practice for that. I just need to say, hey guys, take your folder. I want you to walk it over here, put it in the basket, and then that's what we'll do. And then there's independent practice. If I see kids not doing it, I'll give some feedback. So our understanding of the learning goals, the scope and sequence that comes in that systematically designed instruction helps us more effectively implement explicit instruction. And so in your, as I mentioned, in your handouts that you have, you'll see this particular document. So I just want you to pull it out if you haven't done so. But what you'll see is the first column, that's the I do, you do, we do. And the second column are those other supporting HLPs or practices that are essential for making sure that explicit instruction gives us the full effect or the full benefit. And so you'll see like some of the other HLPs that we won't really talk about today are still critical. We're scaffolding supports and explicit instruction. We're providing that constructive feedback. We're promoting student engagement throughout the whole process, right? So it's not just this single practice that's the magic bullet. All right, so if you can just give me a thumbs up that you have access to this particular document, that would be helpful. If not, this is a good time to get it out. I'm going to show a video here. And thanks, Tammy. And if you have a question, thank you. And so what I want you to look for are some of those practices that you see on this particular handout. If you need help, just let us know. You can put it in the chat box. All right, so here we go. And I'm gonna have to, I already set this up because I will tell you there's a lot of advertisements that occur right now. And so sometimes it doesn't really work. All right, so hopefully you have it out. We're not going to play the full video because I have some other shorter ones, but just look for some of those practices. And as you see them, you can put them in the chat box or just wait till the end of our video and then share out.
And you're going to use your sound box and your letters to do that. So when we're working, first we're going to say the word, then we're going to stretch the word holding up one finger for each sound. Then we're going to move the letters into the sound boxes for each sound. We'll touch each letter and then we'll read the word. Some of the words will only have 3 sounds, so we'll just leave the last one blank. Okay, so watch my example and listen. The first word I'm going to do is dug. The excavator dug a hole at the construction site. So first I'm going to say it, dug. Then I'm going to do it with my fingers, d, ug. Then I'm going to move it. You just watch, d, ug. I'll touch the letters as I make the sounds, d, ug. And then when I read the whole word, I'll do my finger under it, dug. Okay? You can still just watch. Now I'm going to change one letter to change dug to dig. So look at my letters here. Raise your hand if you can tell me, what letter do you think I should change to make dug turn into dig? Grace?
Change the U into an I.
Okay, so I'm going to take the U away and put the I in the middle. So let's all say dig.
Dig.
Let's sound it.
Dig.
Now say the sound as I touch it.
Dig.
And now let's say the whole word.
Dig.
Good. So now it's going to be your turn. We're going to start with a new word. I'm going to put mine away. Your first word is mud. So say mud.
Mud.
Like the pigs rolled in the mud to stay cool. So let's stretch it out.
Mud.
Let's do it one more time with our fingers.
Mud.
Now you move the letters to make the word mud. Good. Now let's touch the letters as they say the sounds. And now do your finger underneath it and say the whole word.
Mud.
Awesome job making the word mud. Now you're going to change one letter to change mud into mug. Like you drank hot chocolate from a mug. So let's say mug first.
Okay. So I'm going to stop right there and feel free to share, but I'll go back to this page. What are some of those practices that you saw in that video? And you can unmute and yell out, or if you just want to put it in the chat box, feel free to do that.
I thought she gave clear expectations, explanations, and then also modeled them and guided practice, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So you saw her model it, and she made it very clear that she was modeling it. She gave clear explanations like you just said, and then she provided guided practice. Anything else that you saw up here? Yeah, maintaining pace, exactly. Repetition, that's that judicious review of it. Modeling examples, and so that modeling multiple planned examples. So if you think about the systematically designed, she had a lesson plan, right? That was sitting there. She had her planned examples out. She had her routine. She knew what she was doing, which allowed her to maintain a brisk pace and then be able to model and then implement the guided practice. Okay. The other thing I'll just say up here is, I don't know which goals she selected her IEP, but something I did notice is her objective or focus of the lesson was pretty narrow, right? She clarified for the students what it was going to be, and then she made sure that the practice opportunities aligned directly with that. Anything else? I think we saw brisk pace, the feedback. You'll see that she did give feedback. It was more around behavior. She hadn't got to the learning feedback as well. And then you'll see here is this desired response format. She did choral responses. using touch, sound, say it, so that she was eliciting responses in a way that allowed her to then take that information and respond back. Okay. So that's just those first 2 steps. Those 2 steps that systematically designed explicit instruction has huge effects. And so that's where we often see the biggest bang for our buck. The problem is for kids with disabilities, it's often not enough. And that's because we need to individualize and intensify for students. And so that HLP 20, and Tom put in the chat box if you'd like to learn more about database individualization, we have to be able to take those data from that implementation. After we did that, right? She's going to watch those kids, she's progress monitoring them, and then she's going to say, oh, 3 of the 4, remember that one little kid was like cheating and looking on other kids? What she might find is that that kid needs more practice opportunities, so she'll intensify it. And that's where the HLP 20 comes into play. And like I said, there's a whole suite of training around that. And Tom Jones is running a community of practice for both administrators and students for that particular practice. I want to get to one around adapting the curriculum tasks and the materials, right? So when we think about these other HLPs, it's not that they exist outside of that systematically designed explicit instruction and the process of review and intensify. So we're still thinking in terms of this instructional framework in the way that we approach our work. And everything that's after that kind of fits within one of these, and in some cases fits within all 3, which kind of happens to happen with our next 2 practices. So this HLP 13, which is adapt curriculum and tasks. So this is the one that I listed that didn't really have the same published effect. And that's because when we adapt, we individualize, and it's really hard to evaluate whether the student's growth is a result of the adaptation or some other individual characteristic. But what we do know is it is a requirement of IDEA. And so if we think about, we have to provide a statement of special education and related services, supplementary aids and services, and program modifications. That single statement in your IEP has this really critical piece around specially designed instruction. And so if you look at the regs, this is where this HLP of adapting comes from, right? Is that we're taking what we know about the student, what we know about systematically designing explicit instruction, and then adapting some variable of what's happening, whether it's content, methodology, or approach to delivery, right? So the design, delivery, or something else that allows us to meet the unique needs of the child. So in the resources that you have, there is a handout. It's a little tip sheet that comes with some ideas around how to do this. The reason I brought up that instructional framework is that we have to design for adaptations. We have to use our data of the student, which is coming with the HLPs from last time, that looks at present levels, what's necessary for the student to progress, what's their baseline, to choose the right adaptations. And then we implement those adaptations, and then we intensify and modify as needed. Under IDEA, we generally adapt in 3 areas. These are the things that we would document in terms of how we're providing specially designed instruction, is what is unique about what we're doing for this kid that needs to be outlined in their programming. And so we think about this content, it's what we're going to teach, right? So are we only going to teach how to decode CVC words? Are we only going to teach math facts up to a certain number? So it's clarifying what we teach as part of that adaptation. We also know that how we teach may be different. The HLPs fall here, right? So it's the use of these HLPs that are unique to supporting kids with disabilities that help us deliver those practices or help students progress. And then the delivery itself. We often think about this as fidelity, is how we're doing it, right? Who's doing it, when it's happening, what's the number of minutes. those are the things that we can adapt for students under this particular high leverage practice. So in the resources that you have, there's this tip sheet that's put together that provides some examples of how to think about adapting either for content or delivery or our methodology. And so just some tips for this particular HLP is making sure that any adaptations are not based on program or disability category. IDA requires that our adaptations that we propose in our programming align with individual needs that are shown through the data, right? That align with your present levels of academic and functional performance. We also want to make sure that those adaptations as part of our specially designed instruction are outlined in our IEP as they then become part of the way we design, right? So they become part of that systematically designed instruction. We know that those adaptations need to be there, and we know that we need to implement those. The other thing is, like, when, you know, we often sort of defer to the district or instructional specialists around the actual delivery of instruction and what we teach. But in terms of these adaptations, because they are a part of the IEP, we want to make sure that we're authentically engaging students, families, and educators, right? It's why a general educator is asked to participate in the IEP. It's not just for compliance purposes, but it's to help us understand what is the benefit or some of the implementation factors when we're moving to some adaptation of the methodology, content, or delivery. And then finally, this is where we go back to those HLPs from the last session, is we don't just take the data to select those adaptations, we then use ongoing data to review and intensify, right? Because while an adaptation may have worked at the beginning of the year, as the content needs change or the students' needs change, our adaptations may need to change. And so that's why we're using the HLPs related to assessment data to intensify or modify for the student. So I want to just stop right there before we get into the last practice and do some more video work. So the tip sheet, Matt, is actually in the handout, but it's also going to be right here in the chat box. There is a tip sheet. So this is just the one for SDI. There are tip sheets for all of the 7 required components of the IEP, but also, and I'll share these instructional briefs as well, but I will just share that the development, you'll see that these tip sheets right here, there's tip sheets around how to write your PLAFs, how to write your goals, all of the pieces of it. And I'll just share too that, you know, there are 7 components required under IDEA for an IEP. States can go above and beyond that, but these are the minimum requirements. And you'll see this overview of statement of aids and services. There are a suite of 4 additional practices or 4 additional tip sheets that align with those. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Miranda. At first I thought you got lost, but yeah, there's a lot of cool things, and it really can help sort of, the whole intent of the site is to help simplify this process, right? We've, in some cases, overcomplicated the design, the planning piece, when we know from these data that the instructional components have the greatest effect. So we want to make sure that we're streamlining the planning, including the IEP development, so we can get those things that produce the results. So I just want to share this last practice before I show some videos and allow you to, I would say, evaluate. One of the best things for you to do in terms of improving your overall practice is to be able to identify and define those practices. Because when we can articulate them and define them, then we're more attentive to it, if whether we do it or not. One of the bigger effect sizes we saw are for teaching cognitive and metacognitive strategies. There is a pretty large investment from the department, from other federally funded national centers around helping promote cognitive and metacognitive strategy instruction. It alone can't replace, right? You can't just do instruction on strategies outside of the context of content, right? So what we sometimes find is people they do a separate class on teaching strategies, and the kid master the strategies, but they don't know how to use it. And so when we go back to that plan, deliver and review and intensify, we think about what strategies the student needs to be successful. We teach those strategies, right, in a way that promotes efficient and effective use of them. But we also have to monitor with data the extent to which they get generalized, right? There are a lot of different strategies that exist. And to be honest, each of these strategies, and I put some examples in here, right? Like self-verbalizing and questioning, it has its own effect size, which is pretty strong. Strategy monitoring, a student monitoring their own strategy, really strong effect sizes. The thing that often gets misused is people assume because it has a high effect size, it works for everything. And that's not really the case. When we think about cognitive and metacognitive strategy instruction, we're helping students not only understand the strategy, right, to be able to do it, but to be able to use the right strategy at the right time. And in order to do that, we have to provide explicit instruction, right? So we teach the strategy, we provide guided practice, right, that sort of deliver, and then we have these planned examples, right, that allow them to apply it to the right strategies. So it's not just as simple as, oh, well, gosh, if self-monitoring has an effect size, let's everyone do it. And instead, it has to align with the needs of the student. So I want to show, this is a very simple example of how this teacher is delivering instruction on, explicit instruction on how do we use this particular strategy. It's only about a minute and a half.
Claire has 6 red water balloons, 5 blue water balloons, and 4 green water balloons. How many blue and green water balloons does she have in all? Alright, so the question is asking me how many blue and green water balloons in all. I'm going to underline the question and circle blue and green water balloons to remind me of what I'm being asked to do and so that I don't forget the label for my answer. Next, I look back at the problem and I see there are 5 blue and 4 green balloons. I don't need the information about red balloons because the question doesn't ask me about them, so I'll cross that out so it doesn't confuse me. The question asked me how many blue and green balloons in all, so I know I need to add 5 and 4. If I start with 5 and count 4 more on my fingers, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I get 9, so my answer is 9. Now it's time to label my answer. I'm looking back at the question and I see that I circled blue and green water balloons because that's what the question asked about, so I know that's my label.
So what you saw is really the same explicit instruction, but it was around strategy instruction, right? So we can do the same modeling. We can do the same planned examples that we might do for literacy instruction. We'd also do for strategy instruction. And I say that because I don't want people to think like we do academic instruction and then we have a completely separate process. So I want to go back to Miranda. So I want to just give you a chance because I'd love you to share out how you see, maybe not this, but what we were just talking about is challenging in a preschool. And if you don't want to put on the spot, you can just say, no.
I'm so sorry, family issues. What was the question? I apologize.
Well, you had put in the chat box that it was, you know, some of this is challenging for thinking about in the preschool. And so I'm just curious, you know, what is that you're seeing, or what are some of the concerns? Because I suspect others have the same.
Right. So the slide you had before, I'm sorry if you could just go back to it. So thinking about self-monitoring, you know, to use a checklist to monitor academic progress. I mean, I can see, and I do recall from when we were going through DBI, there was some kind of pictured goal pages, and I've actually been trying to implement some of them. I'm just, it's so challenging, and maybe it's because I haven't seen it in practice as often. And so just most of those are a little bit tricky, I think, in preschool, and maybe we just haven't seen it enough. And so maybe that's it.
Well, and the other thing I would say about preschool is sometimes we try to take practices that make more sense in a K-12 setting, like a checklist, for example. I mean, the kid can probably barely hold a pencil, and let alone attend to the strategy. It's more around how do we teach self-monitoring that's age appropriate, right? What a 3-year-old can do is very different than what a 7-year-old and 9-year-old can do. And so what I think we often see at the preschool level is developing some of these initial skills so that as they get to the upper grades, they have greater attention to task, right? Like maybe being on task for 4 sustained minutes is a big deal for a particular student. For another student, 12 minutes might be appropriate. So I would, like, you're probably also not going to use graphic organizers, for example. So I don't get too stuck, I think, in these particular strategies per se, but think about what is the intended outcome, right? The learning goal from that planning. What do I want this kid to be able to do? And what strategy is necessary for this kid at this age level to be able to do that? Yeah, so Matt's saying like an organizer is picture of the snacks, or you know, just even like a timer, like, oh my gosh, you know, the timer's going to go for 1 minute. Let's see if you can make the game. So we're teaching the skills for attending that are probably very different than the way we might do it at an upper grade. And if others have examples or ideas, please share it, because Miranda, I think just teaching preschool in general is more challenging than others. All right, so I want to just spend the last part of our session is looking at some actual examples. And so like Miranda was saying, like some of these may not really be feasible in their grade span, or some of you at the secondary level may say, that's too childish for my kid because I'm in a secondary setting. So I'm going to show this particular elementary example, and I'm going to show a secondary example if you're interested. But it is true, the grade span, even though the practice is the same around teaching metacognitive and cognitive strategies, the strategies that we teach and the approach that we teach them vary depending on the learner. All right, so I have to go this way first. All right, and I'm going to actually put this in the chat box in case you were interested. This is from a national center. And please tell me if that link doesn't work or not. It's got a lot of symbols in it, so it makes me a little suspect. So in here, it just talks about some general understanding of what it means to have a cognitive or metacognitive strategy. And 2 of the most common that we see for thank you, Kay, that it seemed to work are when kids are self-instructing, right, talking through it. So you're going to see an example of that. And this idea of self-monitoring. So I think about I worked in low incidence disabilities for a very long time. It's just that stop and reflect. You know, you did your work task. Now let's see, to what extent did I do a good job, right? That's a very important skill that's important for employment, academic success, or even for relationships, right? We want to follow up. All right, so here is just an elementary example.
In this video, an elementary school student uses metacognitive strategies while solving an addition problem. More specifically, he uses self-instruction and a self-monitoring checklist to guide himself through the problem-solving process. By doing so, he actively plans and monitors his work.
I can't figure out what 3 + 5 is. What is it? Well, let me look at my checklist. First, it says read the problem. The problem says 3 + 5. So I've checked that. now it says my checklist says what is the problem asking? It is asking me to add 3 plus 5. Now to draw a picture. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now it says, does my drawing match the problem? Up here it says 3 plus 5, so down here it says 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I have to solve it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The answer to 3 plus 5 is 8.
In this
All right, so just thoughts about this particular strategies. I'm curious, and then Miranda, I'm gonna, because I think exactly what you're talking about is the practice of cognitive and metacognitive strategy instruction is important for all kids, but the way it looks is really dependent upon the kid. So what were your thoughts about that particular example? Seems very unrealistic. Thank you, Terry. It's super sophisticated. The other thing that you probably noticed is it took a long time. And so when we think about cognitive and metacognitive strategy instruction, there are variations. Sometimes when kids are learning an initial task, we might really break it down and model each step and get to mastery of each step. This is something we sort of associate with specially designed instruction. A lot of kids would just pick it up and be like, hey, just count on your fingers. And kids like, okay. But some kids who really have what we would consider like a learning disability or some other learning challenge need to think about a problem very differently and need in their mind like a systematic structure to do that. So while the kid might do this initially, it seems very contrived and whatnot, the assumption is the kid is now changing the way they think about the problem, and the strategy and the checklist will eventually fade away. So yeah, so and then yeah, and I think it's the many steps. And Terry, that's the other thing is how many steps do we teach of a strategy? Sometimes I think about I'm trying to teach my kid just to put his clothes in his laundry basket, not on the floor, not in my bathroom, somewhere else. So I think about the strategy that I might use with my older son is I just say, I need you to put them away. And he's like, oh gosh, sorry. Where my younger kid who has a pretty, significant learning disability needs, like you were saying, Miranda, a prompt, like on his door that said, are there clothes on the floor? Check check the floor. So it's like a reminder for him. And eventually it becomes more automatic that the reminder can disappear. So strategy and instruction doesn't need to always be there. It can be a short-term effect. Anything else you noticed about this? So we kind of was using two different things, right? One was a self-talk. And a lot of kids do just fine with self-talk. They're just saying it out loud. It forces them to slow down. They do all the steps. But like these steps, maybe there were way too many. But if you imagine, like this is one of a high school of a student doing a very complex math problem, we might need each of those steps written out, right? Like they need a prompt because they haven't got them into long-term memory around how to do this particular math strategy. All right. Well, if you want to look at some other examples, feel free to do that. There is a self-paced module that's coming out from the Progress Center that works with all of these other centers that outlines some of those effective cognitive and metacognitive strategies that can be used across the grade span. And Miranda, unfortunately, this center is solely focused on K-12, but what you'll see is that, with your understanding of your kids, you could probably adapt some of those. Yeah, don't worry about it. But... Okay, Now I gotta get back to my little page here, so give me 1 second. Sorry, my thing is not showing me the whole page. All right. So before I show the last video, kind of be like, or take it out the door, I'm just curious if you have any questions or comments or sort of ahas around these instructional HLPs. If you think about it, I guarantee all of you as teachers are doing these practices. The effects that we see is when we're intentional about them, right? That we notice, I'm intentionally having this planned example. I'm intentionally providing modeling for this amount of time. I'm intentionally planning for the instruction. And that allows us to be more systematic and explicit. All right, well, I'll assume if you want, ask some questions in the chat, but I want to do this last video. And so this one is kind of all together. So thinking about all the instructional practices, the assessment practices that you've seen, I'm curious about the HLPs that you see in this particular video. This is a short video of a teacher working with a student, obviously a secondary student. So yes, Matt, I agree. Those tip sheets, and they're publicly available. They can easily be adapted for preschool. The IDEA requires same sort of structure to your IEP, but the examples could be adapted. All right, so here is our last video. I gotta be careful because they got a lot of advertisements that show there. So here we go.
You have your mat there, and you know what? I'm going to make a mat for myself right here because we can do this one together. I'm going to have a box and an equal sign and another box right there. Okay, so we have our fraction tiles. So what problem are we going to work on this time?
3 plus x equals 6.
3 plus x equals 6. So what is the first thing that we're going to show?
3.
3. All right, so I'm going to show 3, and I want you to show 3. And are we going to put it on the left side of the equal sign or the right side?
The left.
The left side. All right, so go ahead and get your 3 out and set them up right like that. Mine are hard to see on the bed, on my tan desk, but it works out. And then to that, we're adding what?
X.
X. So which of these manipulatives can we use to represent X?
The rods.
There, yeah. So we'll go ahead and put our rod there. All right, so I've got 3 plus X. And then on the other side of the equal sign, how many do we have to put up?
6.
6. All right, you want to go ahead and get 6, and I'll get my 6 out here. All right, so I like your double counting there to check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, I have 6, you have 6. Now we want to isolate the variable. And what is our variable? Is it the brown cubes or the green rod?
The green rod.
Green rod, because it represents what?
The x.
X, yeah, so we want to isolate that variable. So how can we do that? What can we do with these units right here to isolate that variable?
We create 0 pairs.
Yeah, we're going to create 0 pairs. So how many 0 pairs do we need to create?
3.
3. All right, so you want to go ahead and create your 3 0 pairs, and I'll create my 3 0 pairs? Okay, all right, we've got that. Now, if you put 3 0 pairs on the left side of the equal sign, what do you have to do to the other side?
You have to make it on the other side.
You have to make it on the other side. And how many 0 pairs are we going to make over there?
3.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and bring out some more. We'll probably need some more of these units. Oops, didn't fall there. All right, so we need 3. Okay, all right. So let's see, my work looks like your work. All right, well, looks good. Now we need to isolate that variable. So what are we going to do with our 0 pairs?
We move them.
We'll move them away because we're going to kind of take them off of our workspace. So let's go ahead and move those 3 0 pairs away. And then how many 0 pairs can we move away over here?
3.
3. So go ahead and do that too. Okay, so when I have 3x plus 6, x equals what?
3.
3. Do you want to go ahead and fill that in there and make sure that that checks out? Okay, and if you told me x equals 3, so I could just go ahead and write a 3 in there. And now you tell me, does that check out?
3 plus 3 equals 6.
Yeah, so did we solve the equation correctly? Awesome, good job for us.
All right, so I'm curious about, I think some people are like 0 pairs, you probably don't use 0 pairs in some of your grade spans. So what were some of the high leverage practices that you saw? And feel free to unmute and or just put in the chat box. Yeah, we saw modeling. What else? And I will actually put them on the here if you want to look at them. What are some of those other ones? Yep. Yeah, so we saw her model those. We saw some practice opportunities. We actually saw what we just talked about with, they were teaching a strategy, right? A way to visualize what we're doing, as well as self, sort of self-evaluating the extent. Yes, the scaffolded supports. Did it look like she had systematically designed what she was doing, or is she just making it up?
Just systematically designed.
Yeah. So that's one of those things, like we don't often see somebody systematically design something, but what we do see is the result of it. So she was able to, she had good pacing, she was able to move forward because she had planned for those examples. Okay. Yeah. Did you see feedback, that HLP 22?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's where we think about like a lesson and what we're doing. It's not like we just do one practice and then we do another practice. It's this interaction of all of these practices that allow us to do something. Now, what happens is maybe she didn't get it. She's like, I don't get this strategy, it doesn't work. That's where we think about that instructional framework. We planned, we delivered it. It didn't go as well as we wanted. So we review and intensify or sort of change our plan. Okay. All right. Well, I want to just give our quick ticket out the door before I pass this back over to Susan. So I put back on the screen the ones that we referenced today, in the bolded ones you'll see there. Just based on what you observed and what you heard today, which ones do you think, or you can just pick one, that you think is probably the most challenging for educators at your site? And we'll do a positive one as well. And I'm going to put a little line so we don't mix things up. So which one do you think are most challenging? Yeah, 21. Yeah, generalization. And Miranda, I'm glad you, and we've talked about that with the taxonomy of intervention intensities. Most of our curriculum and our interventions are not systematically designed to promote transfer or generalization. So it requires a lot on us. I see a lot of 13s, that adapting. Yeah, and I think that's where, when we're looking at specially designed instruction, it is one of the more challenging pieces of the design of the IEP that we offer. Yeah. Tracy, if you want intensive instruction, definitely connect with Tom. And I see a couple of folks mentioning 14, that cognitive and metacognitive strategy. And I'm glad you say that. It seems really simple, but the matching of the strategy to the student needs and to the context is a really challenging skill. So we have to know the potential strategies that are available and then understand what the student needs in order to do the task. Great. Lots of 14. So that's an area where I think we can provide more support in terms of it's out there. And then Chris talking about the feedback, definitely. Feedback is really hard, especially if you have tons of students on your caseload and you really want to do it, but you're just trying to get through the content. So yes, Chris, thanks for sharing that. All right, so this one, I just wanted to share, and I know a lot of people said 14, and so I'm going to assume 14 is one you want to learn more about. Are there any others that you're like, yeah, we didn't talk about it today, but I want to learn more about it? If you can just put that in the chat box, and then while you're doing that, I'm going to pass it over back to Susan to close us out. I want to say thank you very much for participating today. I know it's a lot to think about this, but hopefully as you're sort of reflecting on it, you'll see, wow, I am doing a lot of these things. And now I know where to focus my efforts, so it doesn't seem so daunting or overwhelming. Thanks, Matt. All right, Susan.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Bailey, so much for another great session and for your time.